On Sunday, June 25, 1950, some 75,000 North Korean soldiers, backed by columns of heavy armor, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The 38th parallel was not an international boundary, though it had come to be seen as such in the 5 years since the end of World War II. In fact, the very existence of that line was the product of both circumstance and improvisation. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, her armies still occupied much of mainland Asia. Indeed, the Japanese Kwantung Army in China, still nearly 1 million strong when the war ended, included some of Japan's best troops. The victorious Allies had to decide who should supervise the surrender of those forces, to disarm them, return them to Japan, and then set up local governments in the newly liberated territories. Rather quickly, the Allies agreed that the British would supervise Japanese surrenders in Burma and Siam, or Thailand, that the French would do the same in Indochina, and that Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese government would disarm Japanese troops in mainland China. The United States would occupy the Japanese home islands. But what about Japanese forces in Korea? Japan had annexed Korea in 1910, and ever since then, the Japanese had treated it like a conquered province. Korean men were pressed into service as laborers, treated almost like slaves, to build and maintain Japan's overseas posts. And thousands of young Korean women and girls were kidnapped and shipped off to those posts as concubines for the sexual pleasure of Japanese soldiers, who called them by the euphemism comfort women. Given all that, it is no surprise that the Koreans were happy to see an end to Japanese occupation. In theory, Korea would now become an independent and self-governing state. But of course, some authority had to supervise that transition. After a bit of discussion, the Allies decided that troops from the Soviet Union, which had joined the war against Japan in its last days, would perform that role in the northern part of the peninsula, while American troops would do the same in the southern part. The dividing line between them would be the 38th parallel, roughly halfway up the peninsula. It was never intended to be a boundary. It did not even follow the natural contours of the terrain. It was just a line on a map, an administrative convenience. Or at least that was the idea. When Soviet troops moved into the north and American troops moved into the south, each naturally encouraged the locals to embrace the values and organizational protocols of their new occupiers. The Soviet Union sponsored the creation of people's committees in the north, while the United States promoted an elective democracy in the south, encouraging the presidential aspirations of Princeton-educated Syngman Rhee, longtime advocate of Korean independence from Japan. Elections were supposed to unify the two sections, but they never took place, and the administrative divide solidified into a de facto boundary. At the time, the United States was adjusting to the emerging Cold War in Europe, and in that context, the 38th parallel assumed the importance of a mini Iron Curtain, separating communism from democracy in Asia. South Korea and its government were, in effect, American creations. But what responsibility did America have for them? In Washington, the administration of President Harry Truman worked hard to convince the American citizens that the United States now had a duty to resist Soviet ambitions worldwide. And it was in that spirit that General Douglas MacArthur, who effectively ruled Japan as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, declared in 1949 that America's new defensive perimeter ran from the Philippines to Okinawa, to Japan, and then to the Aleutians. Less than a year later, American Secretary of State Dean Acheson made the same point in almost the same words. Both men were trying to show that American interests now extended well beyond Hawaii and into the Western Pacific. But if you look closely at where that line falls on a map, it did not include Korea or Taiwan. Almost certainly those who were paying attention in both Moscow and in North Korea noticed that. That may be why the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin green-lighted a request from North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, to unify Korea by force. On June 25, 1950, the Cold War turned suddenly hot when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. 8 North Korean divisions made swift and terrifying progress against their outnumbered and under-equipped southern counterparts, who were aided by only a handful of American military advisors. For several weeks, it looked like the invaders would drive the South Korean army and their American advisors into the sea. But Truman responded quickly. On June 30th, he ordered the commitment of American combat troops. The very next day, LSTs based in Japan carried elements of the American 24th Infantry Division from Japan to Korea. Interestingly, some of the LSTs were manned by Japanese sailors who so recently had been bitter enemies and were now partners. That day, too, the American Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Forrest Sherman, declared a naval blockade of North Korea. The war, thus begun, revealed the folly of relying exclusively or even primarily on a policy of massive retaliation with nuclear weapons dropped from the air. Champions of that policy had seen it as a way to provide security on the cheap. Nuclear weapons, they argued, provided more bang for the buck without all those expensive aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. Some who argued that position held that the very existence of nuclear weapons meant that conventional armies and navies were no longer necessary. The North Korean assault exposed that as wishful thinking. It was now evident that conventional forces, including an Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, remained not only relevant, but essential. The trouble was that in June of 1950, the United States had only a few major combatant vessels in the Far East. Among them was the aircraft carrier Valley Forge, which immediately began to provide air support to the outnumbered South Koreans. One entirely new aspect of that air support was the first combat employment of jets from a carrier. In the waning days of the Second World War, the Germans had employed a few jet fighters, including the famous Messerschmitt 262. By 1950, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force both had jets. It turned out, however, that flying jets from a carrier required some significant adjustments. For one thing, jets were heavier than their propeller-driven predecessors. That meant the flight decks on Navy carriers had to be strengthened to bear the extra weight. In addition, the jets needed a boost to attain flight speed from a standing start, so Navy carriers added steam-powered catapults. For the pilots, it was like being shot from a gun. The jets went from 0 to flight speed in just a few seconds, slamming the pilots back against their seats with, as one pilot put it, a real kick in the ass. In the first week of the war, Grumman-built Panther jets from the Valley Forge flew cover for the retreating ground units and attacked the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. Meanwhile, Navy surface ships, including the light cruiser Juno, the flagship of Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, as well as a number of destroyers, blasted North Korean troops moving south along the east coast of the peninsula. In one noteworthy effort to slow down the North Korean advance, 10 Marines went ashore in rubber rafts and blew up a train tunnel. Despite this support from the sea, the North Korean advance continued. At the United Nations, the United States sponsored a resolution condemning North Korea for its aggression. Ordinarily, such a resolution would have been a futile gesture because the Soviet Union, which held a permanent seat in the Security Council, would simply have vetoed it. But the Russians were boycotting the UN in protest of its refusal to recognize Mao Zedong's government as the legitimate representative of China. That turned out to be a huge miscalculation. The Soviet delegation was not present when the resolution condemning North Korean aggression passed the General Assembly, and the UN authorized international resistance. Eventually, some 21 nations participated in the war in Korea, though from first to last, the United States made up the vast bulk of the forces involved, and the U.S. Navy, with assistance from the Royal Navy, carried the burden of the war at sea. The Valley Forge was soon joined by the British light carrier Triumph and a second American carrier, the Philippine Sea, which arrived in August. By the end of the year, the Allies had 8 carriers operating off Korea. Many of them carried jet aircraft, though the workhorse ground attack plane was the propeller-driven Douglas Skyraider. The Skyraiders seldom engaged in aerial combat, but they were ideal for the ground support mission because they had a longer range and could carry a heavier payload than the jets. The piston engine planes flown by the North Korean Air Force were hopelessly overmatched. But soon, modern MiG-15 jets appeared over North Korea. Though these advanced swept-wing jets had North Korean markings, everyone assumed that they were being flown by Soviet pilots. One unspoken protocol of the entire Cold War era was that American and Soviet forces did not directly engage one another. It was just too slippery a slope from that to nuclear war, and neither side wanted to take responsibility for that. So both sides accepted the obvious fiction that the MiGs were being flown by North Koreans. After the Cold War ended in the 1990s and Soviet archives were opened, what had been assumed at the time was proven true. The MiGs were flown by Soviet pilots. The MiG-15s were superb interceptors, and their appearance over North Korea changed the air war. On the American side, U.S. Air Force F-86 Sabre jets, another advanced swept-wing fighter, contested the MiGs for air supremacy, especially in the Yalu River Valley, which came to be known as MiG Alley. Losses remain uncertain even now, but the F-86 probably had about a 1.5 to 1 success ratio over the MiGs. Occasionally, the Navy Panthers also confronted the MiGs. On November 18, 1952, 7 MiG-15s took off from Soviet airfields in Vladivostok and approached the carrier Oriskany in the Sea of Japan. The carrier scrambled 4 Panther jets to intercept them. 2 of the Panthers had engine trouble and had to return to the carrier. The other 2 confronted the MiGs, and in the longest aerial dogfight in U.S. history, Navy Lieutenant Royce Williams shot down 4 of them. The others withdrew. It was a remarkable victory, but of course it could not be publicized at the time because, after all, Russians and Americans were not supposed to be fighting one another. Indeed, Williams did not get recognition for his feat until 70 years later. in 2023 when, at age 97, he was finally awarded the Navy Cross. In contrast to the success of American fighters of both the Navy and Air Force, American efforts to employ long-range strategic bombers against North Korea were disappointing. Air Force doctrine held that heavy bombers striking deep behind enemy lines could win the war by destroying the enemy's infrastructure. To do that, the United States moved several squadrons of B-29 Super Fortress bombers to Japan. These planes had devastated Japanese cities during World War II, but they proved a great disappointment in Korea. They had been effective in Japan because they flew at 30,000 feet, and Japan had no fighter that could climb that high. But the MiG-15s could and did. Consequently, the B-29 squadrons suffered heavy losses. In addition, there were relatively few strategic targets in North Korea worth bombing, and the B-29s were restricted from entering Chinese or Soviet airspace to hit targets there for fear of widening the war. The most effective use of American air power in Korea was the tactical support provided by the Sky Raiders to troops on the ground. Such missions require the close coordination of ground and air units. Radio men on the ground have to provide specific direction and guidance to the planes in the air. And in Korea, especially early on, that proved difficult. Even though the United States had consolidated its military services into a unified Department of Defense the year before, effective cooperation between Air Force planes and Army ground troops remained elusive. Coordination was better when Marines on the ground worked with Marine Corps pilots in the air. During the Defense Unification Battle, some voices had argued that Marine Air should be consolidated into the new Air Force. They insisted that it was wasteful for the Navy and the Marines to have their own separate air forces. Yet in Korea, the effective close-in air support between Marine pilots in the air and leathernecks on the ground was a notable success. One possible reason is that every Marine, regardless of combat specialty, is trained first as a rifleman, something that is still part of Marine culture. As a result, Marine pilots might have had a better appreciation for and understanding of ground combat. Whether or not that was a factor, the partnership between Marines on the ground and Marines in the air was particularly effective. Even so, the numerical superiority of the North Korean Army continued to push the South Koreans and their American advisors southward down the peninsula until by the end of the summer, the Allies held only a small enclave around the southern seaport city of Pusan, the so-called Pusan Perimeter. The North Koreans tried hard to collapse that pocket, but they had missed their moment. Reinforcements flowed in, not only from Japan, and soon enough from the continental United States, too. By August, the number of UN troops in the Pusan perimeter actually outnumbered their North Korean foes. Now what? There seemed to be two options. U.S. and South Korean forces could counterattack from their besieged foothold and push the North Koreans back up the peninsula to the 38th parallel. Or, given that Korea was a peninsula, and because UN forces had command of the sea, it might be possible to make an amphibious landing somewhere behind North Korean lines. But where? One option was to land UN forces 20 or so miles behind the North Korean army. That would break the siege at Pusan and reintroduce mobile warfare. But that was a tactical move, and Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Allied Commander, wanted to make a strategic move. He wanted to land an army more than 200 miles behind the front at Incheon, the seaport for the South Korean capital at Seoul. Its capture would cut off the North Korean army altogether. Victory could be achieved at one stroke. It was risky. The ship channel into Incheon, called Flying Fish Channel, was narrow. So narrow, in fact, that depending on the tide, only one ship at a time could enter or leave the port. Moreover, those tides, up to 30 feet between high and low tide, meant that troops who landed at high tide could become trapped there once the tide went out. The ships supporting them would be literally stuck in the mud. If the Marines got into trouble, it would be all but impossible to reinforce them, or if worse came to worse, withdraw them. It was literally conquer or die. At a meeting of the top U.S. commanders in Tokyo, some generals compared the situation in Korea with the circumstances the Allies had faced in Italy during the Second World War. Italy, of course, is also a peninsula. And when the Allies confronted a strong German defensive line there, they had landed behind the German lines at Anzio. It was a disaster. Anzio proved to be a deadly cul-de-sac that resulted in heavy Allied casualties without forcing a German retreat. What if MacArthur's proposed landing at Incheon turned into another Anzio? This set the stage for MacArthur to deliver one of his dramatic, even melodramatic, presentations. He strode about the room, gesturing with his pipe and declaiming about the importance of seizing the moment. He recalled Wolfe's landing at Quebec in 1759. He spoke of audacity and surprise, the hand of destiny. The other officers in the room were either convinced or intimidated, perhaps both. In any case, MacArthur's presentation carried the day. The landing at Incheon, Operation Chromite, was scheduled for September 15th, less than 3 weeks away. Airstrikes on the target began on September 10th. 3 days later, 6 U.S. destroyers threaded their way up Flying Fish Channel to shell the fortified positions defending the harbor. At 6:30 a.m. on September 15th, men of the 5th Marine Regiment began landing. Rather than storm a beach, as they had done in the islands of the Pacific during World War II, this time the Marines landed in the middle of a city. They used scaling ladders to climb over the seawall. The ships sustaining them hurried to get men and supplies ashore as fast as possible before low tide left them sitting high and dry on the mudflats. It was touch and go. But the Marines secured their foothold, and in doing so, they not only broke open the war, reversing the momentum of events at a single stroke, they also secured their future as America's shock troops. After Incheon, there was no more talk about abolishing the Marine Corps. That afternoon, MacArthur sent a message to Vice Admiral Arthur Struble, who commanded the Navy Task Force. "The Navy and Marines," MacArthur wrote, "have never shone more brightly than this morning." MacArthur's bold gamble had paid off. And it had exactly the strategic effect that MacArthur had predicted. The North Korean army around Pusan, its supply lines cut, began a pell-mell retreat. The American 8th Army hurried them on their way, attacking all across the front and dominating the battlefield. By the end of the month, the North Koreans had fallen all the way back to where they had started. With the objective achieved, that might have been the end of the story. It was not. With the enemy in full flight, MacArthur now wanted to pursue it to the death. Instead of a war to restore the 38th parallel, he now wanted to unify Korea by force. He did not do so unilaterally. He had the full support and cooperation of both the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the United Nations. But there was a caveat. He could advance into North Korea, he was told, provided that neither the Soviets or the Chinese intervened in the war. MacArthur was sure that was not going to happen. He called for a dual advance along both coasts of the Korean Peninsula, and to do that, there was a second Marine Corps landing on Korea's east coast at Wonsan in October. Soon, U.S. troops were moving north quickly in two columns. One problem was that the columns were separated by high mountains that ran along the spine of the peninsula. That meant that the Americans would not be able to support one another in case of a reverse, a problem MacArthur discounted as irrelevant. Hints of Chinese unhappiness with these developments soon reached the United States. Since the United States and China did not have diplomatic relations, the messages came through Indian intermediaries. Few took them seriously. MacArthur thought it was a bluff. It was not. In November, the first elements of 300,000 Chinese troops slammed into the eastern prong of the U.S. advance near the Chosin Reservoir. Outnumbered, the soldiers and Marines began a fighting withdrawal back to the coast. Asked if they were retreating, Oliver P. Smith, who commanded the 1st Marine Division, spat back, "Retreat, hell! We're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." That was good for morale, but the reality was grim. The Americans were not only outnumbered, they fought in horrible conditions as the temperature dropped to as low as 30 degrees below zero. But they made it. At Hungnam on Korea's east coast, the Navy evacuated more than 100,000 soldiers and Marines, plus 90,000 civilians and more than 20,000 vehicles. It was, in effect, an American Dunkirk. The Chinese continued to push south despite the weather, accepting horrible losses but gaining ground. By the spring, they had recovered most of the ground the North Koreans had lost. Back to square one. Now what? A surprise amphibious landing was unlikely to work twice. MacArthur insisted that because the Chinese had entered the war, the United States should now attack China itself, blockade its coast, bomb her supply bases in Manchuria, and support an invasion of the mainland by Chiang Kai-shek's army on Taiwan. America's UN partners were horrified by those suggestions. They had not signed on for a global war. Truman ordered MacArthur to focus on stabilizing the front and regaining the ground lost with conventional tactics. He also ordered MacArthur to keep his opinions about how to fight that war to himself. Instead, when MacArthur responded to a letter sent to him by William Martin, the Republican leader in Congress, with a letter of his own, he seemed to endorse Martin's view that Chinese troops on Formosa should be thrown into the war. And he concluded with his famous line, "There is no substitute for victory." Martin read the letter into the congressional record. In what was unquestionably the most controversial decision of the war, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command and replaced him with General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway accepted the parameters of the assignment, and over the next 2 years, UN forces under his command gradually drove the Chinese and the North Koreans back to a line approximating the 38th parallel. Once again, planes from Navy carriers and gunfire support from ships offshore cooperated in the offensive. In July of 1953, both sides agreed to an armistice. not a peace, but a ceasefire, during which the terms of a permanent peace could be worked out. The two sides agreed to halt their forces in place on either side of a 2.5-mile wide strip of land called the demilitarized zone. It is still there. The Korean War did not end in 1953. It has not ended yet. Legally, it continues to this day. The DMZ remains a no man's land between the two sides. If it was less than a complete and unconditional victory for the United States and its UN allies, it did achieve the initial goal of repelling the North Korean effort to change the map of Asia by force. Led by the United States, UN forces had halted the first overt aggressive move of the Cold War, and both the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps had proved their importance in a Cold War environment. Success in Korea also encouraged American lawmakers to embrace a robust peacetime Navy and Marine Corps. The idea of relying solely on massive retaliation had been exposed as wishful thinking. Of course, the new program would be expensive. United States military spending in 1950 had totaled $141 billion. For the rest of the 1950s, it averaged more than double that each year. Instead of contracting after the end of war in accordance with historical precedent, the Navy would now expand even more.